development, reversal mean for women? In terms of giving you data on this for Sri Lanka, or giving a kind of survey-based analysis, it's a little bit too early. But there is a lot of evidence. For instance, a few years ago, there was a study which was published, which looked at economic crises in 68 countries around the world. And it was called The Gendered Consequences of Financial Crises. And they found several things. One was that female tertiary education, so university level education of women, dropped in most countries that have undergone financial crises like Sri Lanka has. So there was a drop in tertiary education, and that was significant. Another was that maternal mortality, that is women dying in childbirth, women dying during pregnancy, that went up during economic crisis, during financial crisis. On average, they say it went up by 8%. But then you have shocking outliers like Lebanon. In 3 years, Lebanon, is going through a crisis, began just before Sri Lanka. In 3 years, the proportion of women dying in childbirth went up 200%. That was directly an outcome of an economic collapse. So in that way, human development is very precarious, and women's human development is extremely precarious during a crisis of this sort. The third aspect of income poverty I want to look at is something we talk about a lot in Sri Lanka, and that's nutrition and food insecurity. Now, economic crises generally, as we know, increase food insecurity. And what is food insecurity? It's defined when people have no physical or economic access to nutritious, safe, and food that would enable them to live a healthy life. In Sri Lanka, again, this Department of Census survey found 70% of households were cutting back on household expenditure, including expenditure on food. And again, I'm always going to look at the global data to see what we can expect for Sri Lanka. And a study in 2022 by UN Women that looked at 500,000 people, again globally, between the years 2016 and 2021, and looked at them during recessions and crises that happened to individual countries. And they found that women in the age group 35 to 65 are the most food insecure group around. So again, when it comes to food insecurity, and this is very likely to apply to Sri Lanka as well, women are going to be much hungrier, much more food insecure than are men overall. Now, food insecurity also and nutrition has implications for two important aspects of health, which is stunting and wasting. Stunting is when a child's height is too short for their age, and wasting is when you're too thin for your age. And again, World Bank has data on this, and the Sri Lankan government has data on this. And even in 1 year, so that is 2022 to 2023, you see stunting increasing and wasting increasing. So stunting went up from 7% of all children below the age of, I think, 12 to 9%. So again, you see, and that's just in 1 year. And we can expect this again to get worse. Now, when it comes to girls, stunting and wasting has, I think, much more serious implications, or has more serious implications than for boys. Actually, last week, I think on the 29th of February, there was a very recent study published by The Lancet, which is the British Medical Journal. And this is a big study. They looked at the heights and weights of 220 million children worldwide between the years 1990 and 2022. And they calculated a measure of thinness. That is a measure that shows where the children in each country, whether they are too thin. And Sri Lanka came second, having the highest proportion of girls in the age group 5 to 19 who are too thin. They came second in the world. So we have the highest proportion of underweight girls in the world, the second highest. And that was data going up to about 2022, I guess. Yeah, 2022. Now, this again is an aspect that we can expect to worsen in time as the effects of undernutrition in 21, 22, 23, and so on show up in future years. So what I've done is I've kind of outlined some aspects, only a few aspects of this poverty reversal I think we could be beginning to see in the country. Now, you could ask, okay, there's a poverty reversal for 2 years, but surely when economic growth picks up and the economy stabilizes and it begins to move forward, won't this just automatically correct itself? Will people who fell into poverty, will they now be no longer poor? Will their economic conditions get better? There's a lot of empirical evidence globally around the world, and there's a lot of economic theoretical modeling that shows that this is not necessarily true. That once people fall into poverty, a significant proportion of them remain in poverty. Not only that here, but for generations even. So in economics, we call this a poverty trap, that you become trapped in poverty. Now, you get trapped in poverty for several reasons. One is that you could lose assets during the time. So the argument here is that every household needs a minimum level of assets. You need a minimum level if you are to improve over time, if you are to improve economically over time. So if you're going to move from a very poor family to a household to become poor, then to become less poor, over time, you need a minimum level of assets. This could be a piece of land, it could be a tuk-tuk, it could be a job, it could be some jewelry. So you need some asset, and this asset should have the potential to generate income. So it's not a house usually, it's something that you can use to generate income. Now, what happens in a situation like we're experiencing here, where people are food insecure, where you have to cut down food consumption? It could be that you have to sell this asset. So you sell this asset, so you sell give up your lease on the tuk-tuk, or you sell a piece of land, or you pawn your jewelry and you lose your jewelry because you can't afford to get it back. Now, when this happens, your asset holding falls below this minimum threshold and you can never recover it. Why? Because interest rates are now too high to lease a new tuk-tuk when you want to. Land prices have gone up, gold prices have gone up, you can't buy more gold. So you can never get this asset back. And because you can't get this asset back, you remain in poverty for a long period. It could be 10 years, 20 years, and so on. So even a 2-year increase in poverty, a sudden increase, can have long-term repercussions, is what I'm going to say, can keep people in poverty. Now, what does this asset loss mean for women, as we're talking about the issue of the lives of women? There is evidence globally to show, and from India, for instance, that it's women's assets that are sometimes sold first. So jewelry is sometimes the first thing that households lose, because jewelry is an immovable, you can't move it, it's not a fixed asset. So women lose jewelry, usually you pawn it, and then you can't afford to get it back, and so on. So that's one thing to go. And things like land, which men own more of, land seems to be held in the family for longer. So in that way, women would have an even weakened socioeconomic position after this asset loss. Another type of asset, we said, is a job. And again, there is data to show that when women lose jobs during a crisis like this, they take a much longer time to regain a job than do men. Now, there's data for Sri Lanka, and it's only 1 or 2 years old, which shows that fewer employed women have lost jobs compared to men. So the job loss for men, again, this is Department of Census data, is about 18%, and then for women, it's about 8%. But the story, therefore, is not so simple, because when women, there's 8% of women who lost jobs, and that can increase, it's likely that it takes longer for them to regain a job, and men's jobs pick up quicker. So that kind of poverty trap, that's one reason why families could remain in poverty, even though it's this kind of short-term shock can have long-term effects, scarring effects, if you like. Now, another reason for this remaining in poverty, or for these poverty traps to exist, happens through nutrition, and we talked about food insecurity. So we talked about stunting and wasting, and what stunting and wasting does for children is that it affects children's cognitive skills. Okay? It affects cognition and the capacity to learn. So stunting and being underweight and too short, between the age of 0 and 5, means that children's capacity to study, to learn, is reduced. And what does this do? Then this reduces their educational outcomes, which in turn then reduces their job prospects, and which then gives them low earnings, so they could remain trapped in poverty because that get out of poverty is not available to them because of this early nutrition crisis that they suffered. So again, there's recent evidence, actually January 2024, there's a big global study, and it uses data from something called the Young Lives Survey, which is a survey of 12,000 children in India, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Peru, and so on, which is done by the University of Oxford. And this found that stunting at the age of 5, below the age of 5, led to certain types of cognitive deficiencies. And one important one is what you call working memory. And what is working memory? It's something that's really important to all of us. It's like, I have to remember some of this, what I'm saying while I speak, to be able to do two things. So for a child, you have to remember the multiplication tables while trying to work out a maths problem. That capacity falls when you have this undernutrition between the age of 0 and 5, both in boys and girls. So now that, again, could explain why this poverty reversal could be long-term. This nutrition effect could cascade over time. Now, there are other effects. The other poverty traps and falling into poverty and poverty reversal also has life and death effects. And again, we've talked already of maternal mortality. Another area is infant mortality. And again, what you see is infant mortality usually increases in countries that faced financial crises, sovereign debt crises, economic crises. So in India, there is evidence for India that infant mortality increases during economic downturns, and especially in infant mortality for poor households. And why is that? It's typically because poor women, low-income women, tend to work right through of doing harder and harder work when there's what's called a distress offering of labor. So you're supplying labor in a distress situation, and that is harmful for the fetus. So you have women of the low social income groups having high levels of infant mortality. There was another study done last year by OSF, the Open Society Foundation, and they found that what they're looking at is something very relevant to Sri Lanka, which is sovereign debt crisis. And we are having a sovereign debt crisis. So what they look at is what is the effect, and again a very long time frame, which is since 1900. So they look at 131 sovereign debt defaults, which have happened since 1900. And they find the same thing, that the longer the debt default goes on, the bigger the negative effect on infant mortality. One example which is relevant to us also is Zambia. Zambia, defaulted before Sri Lanka, so they're around in their 4th year of a debt default. It's still being discussed and so on. And in Zambia, what this study did, kind of a prediction, and what they find is that every year, say 2030, whilst this default goes on, the longer it takes, 3,000 additional children below the age of 0 and 1 will die in there. So there'll be 3,000 babies dying every year as long for this default. Given that it's taken 3 years now, this will keep going until 2030. You will have, now why is that? It relates to poverty, it relates to health outcomes, rationing, cutting down on public expenditure on health, and so on. So these are very alarming statistics, and which is why alarming analyses, which is why when we talk about what's happening in Sri Lanka, it's really important not to think that economic growth turning around alone is sufficient when we could be having actually a reversal in poverty, which is a very significant factor. Now, the second issue I want to talk about is income inequality. And what do we mean by income inequality? It is the extent to which income is divided unevenly amongst all citizens in a population. You also have wealth inequality, that is income and assets like houses or stocks and shares or jewelry, that is the extent and land, the extent to which income and wealth is divided unequally among a country's citizens. Now, Sri Lanka, now inequality and severe inequality is seen as a big problem in the world today. And why? Because in the last 20 years or so, for almost every country in the world, or for many, many countries, and certainly for developed countries like China, India, even Sri Lanka, you've had this sharp rise in inequality. And finally, economists, at first, inequality was seen as something that's understandable. It's because you work harder that you're paid more, or you have a special talent and therefore you earn more. And that's true to a small extent. But what economists find now is that most of the inequality today can be explained by the term unfair inequality. So you're only doing well because your parents are rich. Your education, getting good results only because your parents are educated, and so on. So it's an unfair advantage. There is no merit. So it's this unfair inequality. So much of this world, and it's the same with Sri Lanka, increase in inequality has been attributed to unfairness and unfair inequality. Now, before the crisis, Sri Lanka had very high levels of inequality. It's actually it's in the top third of the most unequal countries in the world. So the top 1% of income earners earn about 20% of total national income. The top 1% of wealth owners own about 30% of total national income. The bottom 50% of wealth owners own only 3% of total national income. So it's skewed. So there's a big gap in Sri Lanka between the rich and the poor, or between the haves and the have-nots. Now, what has the economic crisis done to this? There's already evidence, actually, even in 2 years, that inequality has worsened, that income inequality has worsened. And that's even using World Bank data. So the Gini coefficient, which is a number as economists use to measure inequality, that has gone up from 37 to 39, just in between 2019 and 2022. Now 39 keeps it with countries like South Africa, Brazil, the US, which are countries which have very high levels of income inequality. Now, what will the crisis do to this? We have a slight uptick. What will the crisis do in the long term? Will there be an inequality worsening, a kind of reversal of development? So I'm talking about the reversal in poverty and also the reversal in equality. Can we say there'll be a reversal in equality in Sri Lanka over the long term because of the crisis? Again, it's very early days to talk about Sri Lanka, but we can always look at global research and see what lessons we can learn. Now, there is again global kind of multi-country studies that show that when countries undergo a sovereign debt crisis, like we have done, it takes on average 7 years for the inequality effects to show up. So it's a lag. Okay? It takes about 7 years to show up. That's one thing. And the second thing is that when countries undergo debt crises, if you take all the debt crises that have from the 1950s to today, the majority of countries that have suffered debt crises have seen a rise in inequality, income inequality. Not all of them, but the majority of countries have seen a rise in income inequality. So that again is a worrying story for Sri Lanka in terms of what would happen to Sri Lankan inequality. Now, I will end quite soon, but I want to just ask at this point, why is inequality then? We know poverty is bad. That's obvious why poverty is bad. People can't meet basic needs. They have no basic access to education. They're vulnerable and so on. Why is inequality bad? And inequality is bad for many reasons. Now, one reason it's bad is when you have high income inequality, it leads to very often the capture of political power by the wealthy or by high income groups. And when you have that kind of link between wealth and politics, often even from a straightforward economic policy making point of view, you could have lobbying, and you'll see that all the time across the world, for policies that are not good for A, the country, even through a narrow economic growth lens, and B, for the majority of the people. So inequality is not good for economic growth. And even the most orthodox of economists would argue that economic growth is an important facet of development. Yeah? So inequality is not good. So the 2019 tax cuts in this country were an example of, you could argue that it was due to the nature of political power and the lobbying that preceded that resulted in the tax cuts, and that brought a catastrophic drop in growth. So that way, inequality is problematic. Now, inequality is also not good for public services and therefore for human development. So, for instance, if in a country the politically and the rich and the political powerful always choose private healthcare over public healthcare, you find a situation where there's a neglect, there's reduced expenditure of public healthcare. In Sri Lanka, 98% of the population use public healthcare, and reduced state expenditure on public healthcare is obviously harmful for men, for women, and especially for women when we have this data on thinness, on maternal mortality and infant mortality and so on. Now, global data shows that women in low-income households in countries with low inequality perform better in their lives than the women in low-income households who are in countries with high income inequality. So you could take a woman who's earning, say, 30,000 rupees a month, and if that woman lives in a country with low income inequality, her income is much more likely to go up over time. She's more likely to better educate her children. She's more likely to have herself better health outcomes and her children better health outcomes than a woman earning the same amount, the equivalent of 30,000 rupees, living in a country with high inequality. So inequality is bad for progression of human development. It's bad for going forward. We use a simple concept in economics to talk about this a little bit more, and it's called the Gatsby curve, or the Great Gatsby curve. The Great Gatsby is a novel written about the 1920s in America, which was talked about before we knew what inequality really looks like today. That was thought about as a very unequal time where income inequality was where the rich were very rich and the poor had nothing. So that's why it's called the Gatsby curve. Now, what the Gatsby curve says is that inequality in one generation reduces opportunities for the next generation. So what it means is that a child born to a low-income family in a country with high levels of inequality, like Sri Lanka, has fewer opportunities for upward social mobility and upward economic mobility. The child can't better themselves over time, and then the child's child, so that intergenerational mobility is reduced when you have high levels of income inequality. You can be poor in a country with low levels of income inequality, and your chances to get out of poverty are higher. So it's like a ladder. If you think about a ladder, and a ladder has rungs, and a high income inequality country is like a ladder where the rungs, there are big gaps. So you're climbing up in terms of social mobility, and it's harder. Where if the rungs are closer together, it's easier. So that is one of the tools we use to look at why also at the household level, inequality is problematic. Now, there is evidence on this Gatsby curve. It was first really looked at for the US and for Europe and so on. This was, but now there's for middle-income countries and even poor countries, it shows that this curve holds. So it exists even for India, China, and so on. And which is why, possibly, that you find overall that gender inequality is higher in countries that have high income inequality. So the two go hand in hand. So whilst inequality is increasing, it's very hard to reduce the gap, the income gap, the education gap between men and women. And development is about reducing that gap as well. You're reducing poverty, but you're also reducing this gap between men and women, and inequality prohibits that. It's a block to that. Yeah? So for these reasons, actually, inequality has also income inequality, not gender or ethnic or racial inequality, as inequality is seen now as very intrinsically tied to human rights. Because even, previously it was outside the purview of the human rights discourse. It was not seen income inequality. It was other types of inequality. But now it's kind of more and more recognized that income inequality acts as a preventer of achieving other types of inequality. It prevents, it slows down progress, or it can be a very seriously undermines other types of inequality. So in that way, it's kind of coming into, from what I understand, the human rights discourse more and more, just the whole issue of income and inequality. So what I've tried really is to show that in two very important aspects of development, poverty and inequality, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka has resulted in a very worrying phenomenon, which is this development going backwards, or a reversal problem. And we could be at the onset, or maybe halfway through a reversal problem. And the second point I want to make is that there is no guarantee that we're going to get out of the reversal problem, that is going to turn and go forward very quickly, just because inflation is now single digit, just because growth is showing 1% or 2%. So these macroeconomic data that we always cling to, that's fine. It keeps, because instability is also bad for women, instability is bad for low-income households. But in a deeper structural way, we could have a reversal. And what does that mean? It means that we need policy to try and stop this and to reverse the reversal and so on. So I won't talk much about policy. I hope the panel will also bring this up. But I'll just make some very brief points. One is that we need to identify, I've sketched it out, but we need to identify in detail what kinds of reversals are taking place. When it comes to women, exactly where, what age group, what sector is it, what type of job and so on. And we need kind of fine-tune policies to correct for that. We need to, of course, the best thing we can do is to stop people becoming poor in the first place. Because that's what the whole poverty trap analysis shows us, is that once you become poor, it's very hard to, lots of households, it's very hard to climb out of it. We also need to focus on interventions. There's a lot of, should interventions just be money-based, like Asfasuma and cash transfer-based, or should it also be asset-based? Now, in countries like Mexico, again a middle-income country, some years ago went through a crisis, and there was a cash transfer, and Mexico anyway had quite a successful cash transfer program before. When they added to that, they found that it didn't benefit anybody. So the cash transfer in Mexico didn't work, except for one group, and that was the elderly women. It worked for elderly women, it didn't work for anybody else. In Bangladesh, we've seen that giving an asset, like giving agricultural people who have no land, giving them some cattle, that worked to get them out of poverty, much more than giving income does. So in Sri Lanka too, it's important to really fine-tune how we approach poverty, and then with a gender lens, how we address that. And of course, finally, I think reducing income inequality, wealth inequality, needs to be a policy objective. Now there's a lot of talk about corporate taxation, wealth taxation, and so on. And I think a wealth tax is important not only as a revenue source, not only because we need to reduce our fiscal deficit, it's important because having a country with very high levels of wealth inequality is bad for everybody. It's bad for the corporate sector because it inhibits growth, and it's bad for middle-income groups, and it's bad for low-income groups because it prohibits progress. So I think I'll stop there, and I will allow the panel to comment on. Okay. Thank you so much.